So I'm going to cover a few things. One is an introduction to Austin Energy Green Building and our rating program. I think as much as the content we're going to talk about regarding embodied carbon, the framework and structure that we have set up is really the mechanism by which we create innovation in the local building industry and start to move standard practice towards alignment with sustainability goals in the city. So that's going to be the first part. Then I'll talk specifically about some embodied carbon focused measures in our commercial rating. And then a couple of teasers about some pretty exciting new and emerging initiatives at the City of Austin. Still probably a little bit too new to present on, but in 6 months or a year, I could come back and then I'll be able to take some questions. So let's see. So Austin Energy Green Building has been around since 1991. We were the first whole building rating system in the United States for evaluating building sustainability. And we're a model for many other cities around the country, as well as the USGBC's LEED certification system. And we provide building ratings, education and outreach, advocacy and planning. And the program's mission is to cultivate innovation in building and transportation for the enrichment of the community's environmental, economic, and human well-being. A little bit more, as of today, we have a green building program staff of about 25 people. It's been steadily growing. Half of those are with our commercial program, and the backgrounds of the staff are engineers, people from the architecture side, and environmental science. So part of the ethos for our program, we show this to all the projects that we work with. Why build green? Buildings account for 40% of energy use in the United States. Also, as Americans, we spend about 90% of our time indoors. And there are lots of health impacts potentially from pollutants in building interiors. Also, sustainable practices support equity, the environment, and the local economy. And relevant to why we're here today, the built environment is responsible for about 42% of annual global CO2 emissions, and approximately 27% of those each year come from building operations. Another 15 come just from a few material streams: cement, iron, steel, and aluminum. Okay, so our rating system, we use a star tier system to rate our projects, and a one-star project is a project that meets a set of 10 basic requirements that every project that registers with us has to achieve. And then to achieve these higher levels from 2 to 5 stars, we have a menu of options that project teams can choose from that align with their project and their sustainability goals to pursue. And while we do happily accept voluntary registrations, and we do get some of those, most of our projects register due to mandatory green building requirements tied to zoning across the City of Austin. And so you can see on the map here, these areas in various colors are some of the zoning districts that have an embedded green building requirement. Some of those are also planned unit developments, and some of these areas also include density bonus programs, primarily in the areas of more concentrated development. And then you can see in this sort of sample list here, central business district, et cetera. Some zones have a 1-star requirement, so they have to achieve our base requirements, while others may have a higher star level. For example, the density bonus program is 2 stars, in some cases 3, and then some areas of town where it's compatible have higher levels of achievement. So I want to talk a little bit about the program's reach, in addition to the map you just saw. Over the past roughly 30 years, our program has rated almost 22,000 projects. In terms of the individual project numbers, you can see most of those are from the single family program. But when we talk about, just because of the nature of, there are more single family homes being built, but in terms of square footage impact, the commercial program has about 400 projects, completed projects under our belt, 60 million square feet. And in recent years, when we've looked and compared commercial permitting data and our program registration, we've touched roughly 60% of permitted commercial square footage in our program. mostly because areas of concentrated development tend to have green building requirements. And then a really important piece of what we do is, as part of a city department, and really with our mandate coming from our city council, we work with our community as we are developing our rating and setting our priorities for the rating. So as we have a 3-year development cycle for the rating, so each time we have some kind of public outreach mechanism. Currently we're using a platform called Speak Up Austin to gather input on drafts of the rating update. And we get feedback from city departments, from building industry professionals, developers, and a lot of engaged citizens across the city. The rating system is really intended not to just be a checklist. We try to respond with the content of the rating to the challenges of our times. That can be global, but also especially our local challenges. And we've charted a path forward towards an adapted future for Austin. And so we touch on many areas: climate, health, equity, and I'll talk a bit more about the structure of the rating system here. We also align the rating system with other sustainability ratings. So LEED is an obvious one, WELL, which focuses on occupant health, and some of these more site-focused systems like sites. And many of our projects pursue multiple sustainability ratings. Okay. Another key, to our program as I'm working towards more of the embodied carbon content is the way we work with our projects. Something that's different from, for example, LEED, which probably many of you are familiar with, is that we're very hands-on. We work almost in a consulting role with our project teams. So I think this lets us get real-time feedback and address concerns directly with project teams, and also coach them, and a lot of times calm them down about what they think they're being asked to do and sort of what the reality is of what they're being asked to do, and we help them get through that process. So in design, we have a kickoff meeting with every one of our projects. These days, most of those are virtual. That always used to be in person, where we talk about the project. We hear from the owner, most of the primary consultants on the project, and we talk about how their project aligns with their green building requirement and ensure that they're set up for success. The way that we sort of maintain, I guess, a leverage with our projects is that we're tied to the building permitting process. So projects that have a mandatory green building rating in Austin need to complete what we call a conditional letter of approval at the end of the design process from our program before a building permit will be issued. And so that's a motivation for our teams to work with us to get through the requirements. In construction, after that building permit has been issued, we track implementation of sustainability initiatives throughout, mostly through an approved submittal process from our teams, and also a mid and final construction site visit. In construction, we have an administrative hold on building permits for mandatory projects that doesn't stop a building from opening. They can get a temporary CO, but there's a hold on their final certificate of occupancy until they've achieved a final approval. While our program does not really work with projects in operational phase, when construction ends, we do have a focus on commissioning and a lot of plans related to various strategies to ensure buildings are set up for success in maintenance and operations, that includes planning and training. So Austin Energy Green Building uses rating systems to pilot and test initiatives and to build local job and materials markets, and ultimately help guide and implement change in our policy landscape. One thing we reliably find is that the development community especially values telegraphing in advance directions for policies that are going to affect their projects. And so in Austin, that mainly involves those ordinances that I talked about in bonus programs and adoption of new local building codes. And so, whoops, sorry. What I'm showing here in this slide is through the rating, we introduce new measures every development cycle that we call innovations or electives. And this goes into a menu of strategies that we think are priorities but are newer to our teams. And so they're optional and teams can select them by choice. Once we get some feedback and sort of test the waters with those, we'll move them into higher levels of sort of in this hierarchy of measures all the way up to one of those 10 basic requirements. So something that would be required of all of our projects. At that point, we're not a code program, they're a quasi-code. And that, the life cycle of these basic requirements lets us sort of test and anticipate how we're going to move certain measures into local codes and ordinances. And Austin Energy Green Building is also responsible for the development of Austin's energy code, so we use this process directly from that. Okay, so that last slide showed some of these measures. I'm just going to take you quickly through a hierarchy of measures. So we have, in our rating, we have core measures, which are curated green building strategies that are essential considerations if the city of Austin is to meet its sustainability goals. And so these are high priority strategies related to existing city programs or pieces of our climate equity plan. And one criteria that we set for these is that they're available to almost all building projects. So we have to conceive of these as being achievable from shell retail buildings that we rate all the way up to like the largest office towers in our downtown. Elected measures are a subcategory of core measures and more at the introductory level that I was talking about. And we also have innovation measures, which are the brand new sort of nascent measures that we introduced over the life cycle of our rating. Okay, I'm almost to the embodied carbon section, but before I do that, I'll just mention that our program is a whole building rating and we focus on many different aspects of sustainability, so holistically and akin to LEED. So we have measures focused on site, energy, water, materials, and IEQ, as you can see here. And this is sort of a breakdown of where the points are weighted in our rating system. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about 4 measures that we have in our rating. One is a basic requirement. I think that was in your briefing packet. There was a little snippet of that basic requirement for materials quantities reporting, and 3 core measures. One is focused on EPDs, another life cycle assessment, and then construction and demolition waste. So I mentioned the climate equity plan in a previous slide, but there is a specific goal related to sustainable buildings in our city's climate plan to reduce embodied carbon footprint of building materials used in local construction by 40% by 2030. This is ambitious. The plan was set in 2021, and it serves as a goal-setting instrument to guide policies set at the department level of the city. And so we just 2 weeks ago had a kind of reality check-in meeting with our Office of Sustainability to see where we are on this path. And I think we're finding that we really have to accelerate our processes and around embodied carbon, certainly, in order to stay on track with these goals. One other little piece of background, and I mention this because what we see here from left to right is a range of policy instruments. I borrowed this from the Carbon Leadership Forum. Starting from awareness, which is really important, right? And it's kind of an entry point to introducing some of these concepts and practices into the industry. And moving all the way to the right to mandatory regulations, such as required performance targets and local codes and ordinances. All of these tiers of policies can move the industry toward desired outcomes. And if we think of this as an order of operations, it shows one of the best practice approaches of preparing the market and enabling building industry players to prepare and plan for implementation. This goes back to that sort of cyclical process that I showed earlier. And I would say a number of cities who started with awareness and voluntary measures have already begun to introduce incentives and even mandatory requirements for building product data disclosure. and whole building life cycle assessment. And I think even Cal Green, which is California's mandatory green building program, already has as one of its compliance paths an LCA approach with a 10% reduction. So that's kind of a market leader in terms of policy. Okay, so now let's look specifically at what Austin is doing in the green building program. So the first measure I'd like to talk about, it's a basic requirement. So every project that registers with us has to achieve this one. It's called materials quantities, and it basically asks for teams to report the quantities of concrete, metal, wood. You can see the whole list here. I'm not going to read it. Used to construct the building. The list of materials, and also we have to calculate the global warming potential of various materials, and then use design phase estimates to identify materials with the greatest GWP. We've built a tool to help projects do this. We don't count on them to figure out all of the underlying information. Really, our ask is that they give us they do takeoffs or analysis of the materials quantities and supplies with that information. We're leaning heavily on the Carbon Leadership Forum's North American materials baselines that we saw in the previous presentation, both for the carbon intensity and also for a materials priority list. And so what we ask for in the design phase is for manual or digital takeoff reports with the above quantities for these materials indicated, and a description of the method used to conduct the material takeoff. So part of this for us is learning about how projects engage with this requirement. And like I said, we work with projects that are tiny. It could be like a strip retail project all the way up to the largest projects in the city. So the level of sophistication of the teams varies, and we were hoping to create a way to introduce reporting that would be achievable by all. But the means that they do that are different, right? So like big sophisticated teams are typically using BIM, and they can use Revit, for example, to pull together some of these quantities, which can be fairly efficient. For smaller projects, they're usually doing manual takeoffs, and that can represent a really large lift for a single architect, for example, that needs to do this on a relatively small project with not a large budget. So that's part of the lesson learned that I'm alluding to. In construction phase, we ask teams to true up purchase quantities. This usually comes from the general contractor side or the subcontractors of materials in each of the categories, and also give us some material invoices so we can understand cost impacts of material choices. I'm just going to go right into some of the challenges for each of these or some context. So, like I said, we needed to create a requirement that right out of the gate was achievable by all the projects we rate. And again, the small projects that we encounter, sometimes this is one of the more time and fee intensive parts of the requirements that we introduce for projects, and it's fully manual. Larger projects, even though they are more sophisticated and have BIM tools, they're still sometimes finding it to be a significant lift. There's a secondary sort of issue that's emerging over the past couple of months that we heard from a really great team about concerns that asking, so their approach to this, rather than pulling from BIM, was to talk to their GC and subcontractors and maybe try to put together big quantities for materials and use that as a way to streamline this process. But they're finding that there is a hesitation on the part of some of the contractors to share those estimates because they feel like there's potential risk to their bids, or providing certain information at that stage might open them up to some financial risk. So that's something that we're trying to address now.
Greg, I have a question. Is this information they submitted to you, is it public, or do you keep it confidential?
It is confidential. So we have I don't talk about this at all in the presentation, but we have a online portal where we track all of our projects. And so project teams only have access to their own projects in that system, and we don't share any of that data publicly unless it's like rolled up metrics that get aggregated with all of our projects together. So no, we don't share this, but the process is pretty collaborative with our teams, and so information shared by one person could make its way through to other parts of that team. Any questions about this before I move? Yeah.
Quick question. Are you, like, in the city doing the calculations for the GWP with the quantity of information that you gather from the project teams, or are you relying on the project teams to do those calculations?
Yeah, so the short answer is we're doing it through a tool that we provide to our project teams. And so part of this is we could do this on the back end just for our own kind of reporting, but we also want to show the results to project teams to create awareness. And so we have a set of calculators that we distribute to our teams. One of them is this materials quantities reporting calculator. And in there, as they enter their quantities, they can immediately see a GWP calculator from the CLF baseline GWP. And if they enter EPD information, which I'm going to next, they can see a delta potentially between their chosen product and that baseline. Okay, so after this, these are all optional measures. They're all core measures, which is the sort of the highest tier for us of optional measures for project teams. None of these are mandatory, and really teams are free to find other places in our rating where they want to achieve points, or they can choose some of these materials focus categories around embodied carbon. Okay, so this EPD focused measure is to provide product-specific EPDs for any of the following building materials. One option for teams is to give EPDs for all of their functional concrete, so all of the functional mixes on the project. Another is to give it for 20% of the construction materials by cost or GWP, or 40% of the construction materials by cost or GWP. You can see here, I don't know if you can see with the mouse, but 1 point for functional concrete, 1 point for 20% reduction, 2 points for a 40% reduction. They can mix and match to achieve up to 3 points. So functional concrete plus one of these other options. And let's see. So there's an intent here, which is to enable building designers to select specific materials that reduce the environmental impacts. A secondary intent is to help create a market signal for the local building industry, or from the building industry to material suppliers, that there's an interest and demand for EPDs. I'd say, so this rating system, I glossed over this, was introduced in September of 2022. At that time, we had very few EPDs in the local market. And several other speakers have shown kind of the impact of concrete, and I think that is a focus for us as well. There were no local product-specific EPDs. Today, all of our local concrete suppliers have EPDs that they can generate dynamically for every mix that leaves their plant. And that I can honestly say did come about as a result of our program. In 2020, we were building a corporate headquarters building for Austin Energy, where my office is today. And we actually worked with Dirk Kestner, who was mentioned earlier, to talk to concrete suppliers in Austin and signal to them that we really were going to prioritize concrete mixes with EPDs. We weren't requiring any reductions, simply that material was available. So Martin Marietta ended up being the vendor, and based on that ask, they generated this plant level sort of EPD process, and supplied EPDs for all the mixes. And then in very quick succession, because there is competition in the local market, all of the other concrete suppliers began to do the same process. The last one, actually, we had one straggler who just did it in the past year. But these kinds of choices and signaling these kinds of demands really can quickly move the market. And I would say also anecdotally, through conversations going years back with the concrete industry, they kind of knew that the writing was on the wall to produce EPDs and to start to look at some of these embodied carbon related topics. They're just waiting for somebody to tell them to do it or to ask them to do it. And so moved with surprising speed.
So are you considering taking those into the basic requirement?
It's a good question. I mean, very, very likely. And I think also the next thing I'm going to talk about, I believe, which is LCA, is something that we can consider moving to a basic requirement. With EPDs, I think it's starting at least to very clearly, in some definition, fit our requirement that all projects can achieve this, because we do have now that sort of base of available products with EPDs. So it's a very likely contender for a basic requirement.
I need to clarify something. So you're with the city of Austin?
Yes.
And so
yep.
this is any project coming, or these are projects that are coming to you that the city is building?
Well,
Or can it be both? I
Great
just want to
question.
make sure.
Great question. It's both. And so our municipal projects are not required by ordinance to participate. They're actually exempt from the zoning ordinances. However, the city has a green building policy internally. And I guess about 10 years ago, they used to have an option. It was a LEED-focused requirement, that it was a LEED or Austin Energy Green Building requirement, and now they are primarily rating with our program. And so in the current day, we are rating all of the municipal projects as well as all the mandatory projects in those zoning areas. The other piece that I'll say about that, I was going to kind of save it maybe for the final point, is that we do use the city, and the city also kind of is used by council initiatives and other initiatives to be a test bed for a lot of these more advanced, I would say, sustainable strategies. And so the city is doing a really good job right now of figuring out, doing the cost-benefit analysis for not only embodied carbon, but a lot of other sort of pressing concerns related to our climate equity program. Okay. All right, so life cycle assessment is another of those core measures. And I think I'm going to assume that everyone here knows what this is, at least at a high level. So projects can conduct an LCA for structure and enclosure, either structure or enclosure, structure and enclosure, or they can achieve or demonstrate an estimated 5 to 20% GWP reduction through an LCA. And you can see these various sort of tiers of points awarded based on the effort. To go back to your question, I think life cycle assessment is a likely successor to our current mandatory reporting requirement, but there are a lot of challenges here to wider scale implementation on the path to standard practice. And there are two sides of the same coin, and they're both related to kind of the technical expertise that's required to perform a high quality LCA, and also to review an LCA as the city or with our program to make sure that it's high quality and conducted in a way that makes sense. And I mentioned earlier that the state of California is starting to offer this. I think we're looking around as well, like you are, to see who is starting to tackle this and what issues they're encountering. Because while there is growing LCA expertise in the market, it's still not something we commonly see from our projects, unless the client is usually a large corporation that has sustainability goals, and this is part of their sort of required process.
What is the enforcement tool, or is there one? I mean, they send you the plan.
Yep.
They go through everything.
Yep. For LCA specifically?
Any of it. I mean, you're approving them based on this. Do they slide around and change different things, or how do you follow it?
So I'm not showing it here, but we have a big book, which is our guidebook for our rating. And every measure in the rating describes a set of documentation that's required to demonstrate achievement of the measures. And we have at least 2 staff members that are assigned to every project that give a really, I would say, in-depth review to everything that the project is pursuing. Speaking about LCA specifically, it's a challenge, right? Like I said, because we don't necessarily have staff that have a deep LCA expertise. And so a lot of times we're going to rely on the structural engineering firm is often the one that conducts it, sometimes an architecture firm, on kind of known experts in our local building industry and trust that what they're doing is correct. And sometimes we might ask for a narrative explanation, but we don't have a really solid mechanism now, especially when it comes to defining the baseline for LCAs, to say what that is and to review.
But didn't you say previously, though, that you have to issue a letter to the city saying that they have met the requirements and that they would not be allowed a CO?
Correct, so.
So that's the enforcement.
Yeah, so that is the method of enforcement. And so for projects that are pursuing a 1-star rating, that's achieving our 10 basic requirements. For all the other projects that need a 2 or 3-star rating, it's ensuring the basic requirements plus all of those optional measures have been achieved. And at that point, we issue this letter that allows them to get through it.
I mean, if they're coming to Austin, they're doing this. I'm just curious from the other
Yep.
side, how that works.
Yep. And then the last one I want to mention is, it's not necessarily embodied carbon focused, but I think some other presentations have alluded to it. And this has been, in some form, an element of our rating system for a very long time. The City of Austin has a zero waste plan, which is really focused on diversion from construction and demolition waste, diversion from the landfill. There is an emerging focus on deconstruction and circular economy. And so I wanted to mention this without going into too much depth. But let's see. What we're talking about here is essentially recovering assemblies and materials from existing structures rather than sourcing new ones. And in some cases, those can be used on the same site in a new building, replacing something with something previously constructed, or there are moves afoot, and they have been for a while, to create a local marketplace for deconstructed and salvaged goods, which would create additional options for teams to sort of pick and choose elements that have been stored there from projects around the city. Next year, we're planning we're in the beginning of stages of planning a really large symposium around deconstruction specifically. And some of our city projects are closely looking at it now. Okay, I was going to have a little breakout exercise, but in the interest of time, I'm going to pass on that and just kind of go to my conclusion. Some of those near-term initiatives that I mentioned I think are really exciting and are big next steps forward. They're not quite ready for prime time to talk about, but there are lots of meaningful activities happening. So the first one is something that I'm working on through our program, which is local whole building embodied carbon probabilistic baselines. We're working with a team at the University of Colorado Boulder. We have been for 2.5 years now, and we've got another couple of years with them to develop really targeted local baselines for the building stock in Austin that we can use to start to set targets for our projects potentially in the rating, either as an optional measure, eventually a requirement, and then that could expand potentially into local ordinances. Also, last March, Austin City Council put out a call for development of a lower, they called it low carbon, we're now calling it lower carbon concrete plan for municipal capital improvement projects. So this started as a kind of a vague ask, structured in a way that would start with data gathering, and then over a period of 5 years move to mandatory achievement of certain establishment and achievement of targets by municipal projects. This is going faster than anticipated. I think there was a little bit of background. So this project was assigned to the office of the city engineer, and the city, as you can imagine, is pretty conservative about the way that it sets requirements for projects. One of those conservative kind of strategies that had been around for as long as time, I guess, is that there was a list of pre-approved mix designs for concrete that was just basically a prescriptive menu that every project had to draw from. And none of those really addressed embodied carbon at all. None were really like any innovative mix designs. And there was a lot of resistance from the city engineer to kind of open this up beyond what we would call horizontal construction projects, which is like roadways and sidewalks and all that kind of infrastructure. But through a lot of negotiation, through a lot of collaboration in the city, we now have a building-focused arm of this as well. And the city engineer and some other engineers in the city now are rewriting their specs to allow for more of a performance-based approach, which would in theory allow project teams to submit any design that fits a certain set of performance criteria on their projects. This is a really big move for the city. And then, like I said, there's an emerging deconstruction focus. And then this last one is also huge, and it touches on various departments around the city and really starts to, I think, enable incentives and other types of programs that can address embodied carbon directly, and that's establishing carbon as a common reporting metric for our programs. One example of this is, so our program is housed within our municipal utility. So we're in kind of the customer-facing programs part of the utility. A neighboring group is our incentives group for energy efficiency. They really want to be able to somehow address this piece of the carbon puzzle, but they can't because it's not really tied to any of the utilities programs. However, the city as a whole moving to a carbon metric would allow even this group potentially, who's working with building teams on installing various efficient equipment, et cetera, to maybe start to look at incentives for embodied carbon as well. And I'm gonna wrap there. I've got a few, here's my email. A few places you can go for resources. One is our rating program where you can see the calculators in the guidebook that I talked about. Our Carbon Leadership Forum is an excellent resource that I think many of you know, and Architecture 2030 also, I think in terms of painting the picture of why these issues are important is a really great resource. Talked to Lance about this earlier. I'm not going to be able to share my slides for a couple of weeks. I have to have them edited through an internal process, but eventually I will be able to share more resources with all of you.
Can you talk a little more about the types of incentives you're using?
With our utility program?
Anything.
Primarily, so there are a set of, I'll talk about the utility programs, and it's focused on energy efficiency and demand reduction, right? So peak demand reduction. There are some prescribed programs around specifically like, HVAC or heat pump water heaters for projects that can either replace old equipment and with newer, more efficient equipment, or even change the type of equipment and show that delta through a calculation. So we pay out based on that delta. There are also custom rebates, so projects like this building, for example, I noticed has skip-stop elevators, which I think are really cool. Those do, if they're operated in a certain way, come with energy benefits, but they're not so common that we have a program developed around them. So in those kinds of cases, teams can work with our rebates group to do some calculations to see what kind of benefit, a payable benefit might come out of that.
So that's the utility.
That's the utility.
If the project goes above and beyond the STAR system, can it get like density bonuses or anything like that?
So I mentioned the density bonus earlier. The way that works is if a project is in, so normally they're going to be building in a mandatory green building zone already, but if they want to unlock a density bonus, one way, they can either pay a fee, which is a pretty hefty fee, or they can achieve a green building rating and reduce a lot of that fee. So that's where that comes into play. And what it will do is usually bump up the required level of achievement by like one star in our program. Yes.
You mentioned the concrete companies and being told, but has there been any pushback? Are there any projects that just leave the market because, is there a price increase?
Well, anecdotally, we've heard that most of these projects with lower embodied carbon are on par with typical or higher embodied carbon products. It's something that we're interested in tracking and understanding more about, which is why we're asking our teams to report cost information as well. But since the projects we work with are typically a 3-year completion cycle, we don't have a lot of that data yet, but we'll be getting it later this year.
How soon do you see the baseline for LCAs getting established? Because we have an awesome office, we have a Denver office, and I talked to them specifically actually about this. And that was the biggest problem, because the LCAs don't really have like a codified standard.
Yep.
And then my second part of that is like, do you see it sort of evolving sort of the way energy modeling did, where you have this like very hard line code, and eventually we kind of learned from that and said, all right, if you can kind of prove it using this specified thing, we'll give you the same code recognition credit, right?
I my first job with green building was as an energy model reviewer, so I have a little bit of a bias that I'll disclose here, but I mean, in my mind, yes, there's very much an analog with that energy modeling process and an LCA process. And I don't know how many in the room are familiar with the energy modeling process, but there are sort of codified methodologies now in code that lets a project demonstrate energy reduction or energy cost reduction through models, and that's also a code compliance tool. That doesn't exist for LCAs yet. I think there are moves afoot to kind of start to standardize what a baseline will look like. The way we do it first in our rating, especially in like a more of a voluntary measure type, is to use some of this research from UC Boulder to just set a number based on the project characteristics, and then have the team only produce a proposed model to compare to. I mean, they'll probably still do both, but we use our baseline number as the baseline floor.
We've kind of hit on that. California, I think they're close to that. Is that really right?
I think, yeah, I think Calgary is the one who's furthest along with more of a, it's still not mandatory because product teams have other paths that they can pursue, but that is now a path in their code. And I think they do have some rules around how that baseline is defined.
Like we have to like model that establish a baseline, so that we equivalent score for advantage of building type, and then you prove, and you do another one.
Maybe that's your model
Reduction.
The trick is really, to give a little more context, is like there's a baseline model which is supposed to represent standard practice or like a code minimum in the energy modeling world, and without a clear definition of that, there's room. I'm not going to say for gamification. I mean that could happen, but even just clarity around consistently defining what that is, so that projects are operating on a level playing field when they're calculating their savings.
I have tons of questions about this, but so we're design construction, so we're working on sustainable procurement guidelines essentially. So that starts with our Division 1 specs, which incorporates all the whatever except requirements. But we're using kind of pre-qualified vendors that we kind of pre-vet for our kind of sustainability initiatives. Have you guys considered something like that? Outside of like concrete, obviously, with the
It's really tricky as the city to do that and like to kind of pick who is going to be able to operate in the marketplace or participate in the program. So there maybe is a little bit of an analog with our rebate programs because they do require all the contractors who are participating to go through an application process and to basically agree to participate by the program rules, and that's the gateway to entry for them to play in that sort of area. So it's possible, but it's tricky.
Yeah.
Yes.
How long did it take from the kind of inception of the idea until the policy was approved in its first phase?
Are you talking specifically about the requirement in the green building rating?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess we've had LCA in the green building rating since I think 2007, but it wasn't necessarily focused on global warming potential or carbon emissions. It was more holistically focused because LCAs can look at a range of environmental impacts. So it's been brewing, but I think, as most of you know, like the focus on embodied carbon is still relatively new. I mean, it's probably 5 years ago or so is when we had more focused attention on embodied carbon as an issue. I think also that was around the time that like the Carbon Leadership Forum was emerging and becoming more of a focused organization, and they've done a lot to really kind of define what this space is and define the issue in the U.S. So something like 5 years, and this also was a case where, like I said, we typically will introduce something in our rating that's not a mandatory measure and then move that to a more mandatory requirement. This is a case where we kind of leapfrog that process, recognizing that this was an immediate concern that we needed to address, and that time was of the essence. That also informed the way we structured it, right? Like instead of saying like, everyone needs to do an LCA, we did a like version of that to say, just start to report your quantities, create some awareness in the marketplace, show some data to projects. Teams can go further than that if they want to, but they don't have to.
Yeah. Make the entry easy, right, and then build on it.
Yeah. Yes.
You spoke on your construction waste diversion and that you're wanting to get more into like the deconstruction and reuse.
Yes.
But for the construction waste, are you all like incentivizing anyone to treat their trash differently?
Well, it's no longer incentives, it's through ordinances. And so the city has a construction and demolition ordinance that's administered by it's called Austin Resource Recovery, which is our waste management program. They're a really great group of folks that I could give you some contacts if you're interested in reaching out. And we partner with them on all these related topics around deconstruction, demolition waste. Basically, our approach to demolition waste mirrors their ask. It's just that we work with our project teams to make sure that they're following through on all of those requirements. Yes?
And for that ordinance, is there like a fine associated if they don't?
Yeah, in theory.
Sorry.
In theory, they're
Oh, okay. I didn't hear that.
Sorry, what was that?
Never mind.
No, I was gonna ask the same question.
Yeah. Yeah, in theory, there's legal recourse for those projects. I don't know. I'm interested to find out like how far the city has taken that or will take it. I think to be totally transparent, I think Austin Resource Recovery is still struggling to get all their projects to fill out the documentation that's required to demonstrate compliance. And they don't necessarily feel empowered now to like really go that route in terms of like fining or penalizing the project teams to do it. So it's kind of goodwill. There is in theory a legal mechanism there, and there is a reporting requirement, but no one is really exercising it to my knowledge in that way. Our largest projects do report, and I think those are the ones with the highest impact. It's the smaller projects that tend to not either know an ordinance exists or not know how to do it and try to sidestep it.
If you were giving us advice, it sounds like the smaller projects have really been
Yeah.
problematic.
Yeah.
So do you have like we're thinking about this in our commercial core, there's not single family or anything like
Yeah.
that, but do you have a recommendation on a base size that?
I could only throw it out. Like I think it's worth studying, but I think we will probably. We're thinking now about how we might restructure this basic requirement. Even in the intermediate term, I think what we're talking about potentially is having in the design phase projects report some characteristics of their project rather than doing a full materials estimate, so that we can kind of generate through like a regression model or something, some kind of estimate about where they should be and give them some tips or pointers about what to focus on in design, and then wait until construction when that's all been kind of rolled up and finalized to get the data that we would actually use for some of our baseline calculations. That wasn't your question, but in terms of like a square footage, I don't know. I think our program has a lot of projects that are kind of, or a group of projects that are probably sub 20 or 25,000 square feet, and then they go quickly much, much larger. So probably something around that 25,000 square foot mark, I would guess. Or there could also be a tiered requirement also, like instead of just saying you don't have to do this if you're below a certain size, you do something different.
Do you include TI?
The tenants?
Yeah, you do tenants.
It's complicated.
Yeah. I'm just curious about that.
So I'll say this, we do not rate tenant finish outs, we rate base buildings, and we set up a process with owners to basically do the rating on our behalf for tenants after the building is operational. So it's a commitment
Tax incentives,
for the rating.
the rating, any of the,
Potentially, something that, so the administration just changed, right? And there were a lot of incentives through the IRA program that were related to many of the equipment upgrades and other strategies. I think the picture is murky right now, but as that program is being launched and a lot of other funding sources as well, part of what we were doing is the city was trying to get a really good handle on that menu of available options, both for city projects, but also to share with all of our building industry stakeholders so that they can leverage them. So there are, but they're piecemeal, and they're usually focused on something specific and not necessarily a whole building or a holistic type of performance. Yes.
Are you guys collaborating with construction cost index companies and estimating companies or anything like that, exchanging data information or get them to incorporate your information, let's say, into their charts? So the data becomes available, let's say, nationwide?
I would say no, we're not directly. I mean, RS means is probably like the source that you all know and that we've sometimes looked at to estimate cost information. Honestly, cost is one of the trickier things that we've been trying to get a handle on for a long time, but costs fluctuate all the time. Teams don't always want to share their cost information for certain things. So I would say no, that's desirable, but we're not currently doing it. And in terms of sharing our data, I don't know. We don't currently have a plan. Like we're struggling in some ways to get the cost data just for our local space, and so I don't know if we have a robust data set that would benefit anyone locally over time, and that we're really set up to be able to keep that current, over time. So it's a really good idea. I think there's a lot of value in that, and something that we can think about, but not currently doing it.
Maybe have time for one more question.
I'll throw one in.
Okay.
So one of the things we're trying to figure out is where in the project development process we need to have points of intervention.
Yeah.
You're kind of in the middle of it since you're sort of city in there.
Yes.
What would you say to that? I mean, how should we would not be internal to the city, so do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you in a little bit more detail how our process integrates with the permitting process, and then I'm not sure how you might find an analog for that. So we have a development services department, which is our building code enforcement, right? And so when a project applies for their site plan or their site development permit, there's a review done by that staff that sort of uncovers, you have a green building requirement because of where you're building. And so they tell that team, before you go any further, reach out to the green building program and get your project registered, and you're going to need this letter of conditional approval at the end of the design phase prior to building permit. That typically gets teams in at late schematic design or design development to us. Sometimes there are lagging. Usually smaller projects might tend to lag. The larger projects sometimes come in way earlier. They know, they're sophisticated enough to know we're going to have to do this. We want to come in at schematic design, early schematic design, and start having conversations in-house so we can set goals for this project and make sure that we're set up to achieve the rating, especially if they're pursuing a density bonus program or if their ownership has really high level goals. They come in very early, and that's what we recommend to every project. It's trickier. And I think it shortchanges our project teams and doesn't really give us the benefit of our program as much if we start working with a project that's got their design kind of locked in. But we do require them to give us a 50% DD and CD set. So that's kind of the floor that we set with our teams. And we had to sometimes move that DD requirement because the team comes in we're already in construction documents. I don't know. I mean, what kind of, how do you know about the development projects that are coming in? Why do they start talking to you?
So we see them at the zoning phase.
Yeah.
And that's where we're trying to figure out what we can do at the zoning level versus what's then in the buildings department, which is more site development and all that. And then it seems like the controls are at the CO or in the building department, but the conversation really needs to have started a whole lot earlier than that. So we're trying to figure out.
Yeah, I mean, and we
How
do have something like that in a mechanism, right? Which is through zoning. I would say especially through the planned unit developments, because those are typically developed through negotiation with the city council and a development effort for various tracts of land in the city, usually in the urban core. And there's a whole process of departmental review all the way from watershed, to our program, and we can propose, going beyond saying you just need to get a 1 or 2 star rating. We can say, but you also need to achieve these specific measures in the rating. That could be an LCA. I mean, it could be whatever we want to, as long as we got sort of buy-in at the council level in those negotiations. I could see that happening, and maybe that's part of the way to do it. Is you can be really prescriptive about a priority topic in some of that zoning language, if you have that ability.
You should also be prescriptive about the deliverables too.
Yeah, yes.
Because that will force our hands
Yeah.
to develop certain things at a certain point.
Yes. Yeah. Good point.
Or regions.
Yep.
I think Georgia is very good about that.
All right. there are more questions, you'll have my email. I'll be around a little bit afterwards, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.